Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. I'm Laura Miller, a fellow Googler, and I feel honored and blessed to be standing here today introducing two personal heroes of mine and sharing their brilliant minds with my Google family. As many of you know, I was diagnosed exactly 1 year ago with breast cancer and fortunately labeled no evidence of disease this past July. Thank you. After my diagnosis, I received an outpouring of love and support from many Googlers, quite a few in Google Chicago, so thank you. And unfortunately, I received too many notes saying that they had faced a similar diagnosis as myself not long before me. So we have quite a big Google family here that is facing this issue. And my good health today, and the good health of many Googlers, could be attributed directly to individuals who are pioneering, driving change, and innovating in the breast cancer landscape, in particular the two that you'll hear from today. So Fran Visco is amazing. She is a 25-year breast cancer survivor and the president of the National Breast Cancer Coalition, which is an organization not all unlike Google in the sense that they're willing to make big bets and they care first and foremost about the population that they serve. She served 3 terms as one of 3 members of President Clinton's Cancer Council back in the 90s. She co-chaired the National Action Plan on Breast Cancer, and she was the first consumer to chair the integration panel of the Department of Defense peer-reviewed breast cancer research program. She is a member of the board of directors of Translational Research in Oncology, among many other national boards, and she is a world-renowned thought leader in the breast cancer landscape. Alana Welm is also incredible. She is an associate professor in the Department of Oncological Sciences at the University of Utah, an investigator at the Huntsman Cancer Institute, and co-leader of the Cell Response and Regulation Program at Huntsman Cancer Institute. Her lab focuses on breast cancer metastases, which unfortunately has no cure today, and she's made groundbreaking discoveries that are widely renowned in the breast cancer community and beyond. Her research development may lead to new ways to treat and prevent breast cancer metastases, which we'll talk more about today. So without further ado, I want to give a warm Google welcome to Fran Visco.
Thank you. Sorry. Thanks very much, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here to talk to you about breast cancer, how we can end it, and the National Breast Cancer Coalition. So our mission is to end breast cancer, and we do have a strategic approach to achieving that mission. But we all have a role to play in ending breast cancer, and we have to use every possible avenue to get there. So the National Breast Cancer Coalition, which I have the honor of being president of, was formed in 1991 as a coalition of groups from around the country. And we have 2 arms. We have an advocacy arm, a grassroots advocacy arm, that sets a legislative and public policy agenda and then works to get it enacted into law. And we have a program arm that complements the public policy work. And I'll talk a bit about the programs that we have. And our goal really is to change all the systems in breast cancer. We weren't formed to raise awareness. We do not do direct services. Many of our member organizations do. We are really about system change. And again, our mission is to end breast cancer. So I'll give you an example of the advocacy work that we do. Funding for research, expanding access to care. Funding for research is, as we know, vital to ending this disease. And the federal government is where the major research funding comes from. We do a lot of community fundraising, or many of our groups do, raising money for research in their communities, and that is important. But the hundreds of millions of dollars year in and year out that are required for high-level biomedical research comes from the federal government. Expanding access to care, we all know, and we know we've been a part of this battle very much most recently, that we can find the answers to breast cancer. We can know how to prevent it and how to cure it, but we will not have ended breast cancer unless everyone everywhere has access to those interventions. And so a main priority of NBCC is to make certain that the policies are in place that will expand access to the right health care. We're involved in education and training. We educate and train advocates, lay advocates around the country and even around the world to understand these issues and to understand the language, the concepts, and process of science so that they can collaborate, so that they can sit at the table and help decide how research funds should be spent and also what research should happen. And Alana will speak a bit more about that. But we're about critical advocacy. We're about critical analysis, an analytical, informed approach to what advocacy should be, not a knee-jerk reaction to issues in breast cancer. And we are very much about the importance of leadership from the lay public, from educated and trained advocates with a constituency. They should be leading all efforts in breast cancer. So let's talk about U.S. progress in breast cancer, because I think we all think, the public believes that we've made such strides in breast cancer and that we're very close to figuring this out. But the numbers tell a very different story. So in 2017, in the United States alone, over 300,000 women will be diagnosed with breast cancer. And 2,600 men will also receive that diagnosis. Now, we know there are two main types of breast cancer. There's invasive breast cancer, and there's something called in situ, ductal carcinoma in situ. And that really isn't cancer. That's a condition where we have abnormal cells in breast ducts, and it has not invaded into tissue. That is a phenomenon of mammography. Before mammography screening, we didn't know there was such a thing about DCIS. And DCIS is a very controversial issue in breast cancer because we really don't know if any of it will progress to invasive breast cancer, and if any of that invasive, which of that invasive breast cancer will progress to become lethal. And we'll talk more about that later. But this year, breast cancer will take the lives of over 40,000 women and 460 men in this country alone. And I'm going to show you a graph in a little while that will show you that there's no change in lethal disease at diagnosis since 1978. No change in diagnosis of lethal diagnosis. And there's no acceleration in the rate of decrease of mortality. You may have heard that recently the number 39% reduction in mortality and breast cancer death rate. Well, that is a correct number, but it is not a number that tells the whole story. It's a relative number. The decrease in mortality has been 1.9% a year for a number of years now. 1.9, 1.9, 1.9. You add that up, the relative decrease is about 39%, but there's no acceleration in the rate of decrease, which there would be if we were continuing to make progress. But the global progress is even worse story. 1.67 million new breast cancer cases will be diagnosed in women, and more than 500,000 women worldwide died of breast cancer in 2012, which is the most up-to-date year statistic that we have from the World Health Organization. But it is estimated that in 2035, that number will be more than 800,000 women at the current rate of progress. So this is really the reality of breast cancer. And I think it's important to look at this particular graph. You'll see breast cancer incidence, which is the diagnosis of breast cancer, and mortality across 40-plus countries. The blue line is incidence, and you will see that in developed countries, that line is very long. The red bar is mortality, and you will see across 40 countries not a significant difference in mortality. What does this tell us? This tells us something about the limitations of technology, because the blue line, the blue bar, tells you that is how many women are diagnosed because of screening. So in developed countries, we have mammography screening. So you have many, many, many more women diagnosed. But the number of women who are dying of breast cancer does not change across countries very much. So that tells us that there are significant limitations in early detection. This is, again, the reality of breast cancer. This is a graph that shows you since 1978, actually, until, actually this goes now to 2015, there has been no change in the initial diagnosis of lethal breast cancer. And lethal breast cancer is metastatic breast cancer. Because if you were diagnosed with breast cancer and it stays in your breast, it won't kill you. If it leaves your breast and goes to another organ, then it becomes lethal, and we don't know how to cure lethal disease. So initial diagnosis of metastatic disease, that statistic hasn't changed. Breast cancer is a political issue. And what do I mean by that? I mean by, as I said, the significant sustained funding year in and year out for research comes from the federal government. And we can influence what that number is, and NBCC has influenced that. How is the funding spent, though? Now, we brought about over $3 billion new through our advocacy to the worldwide scientific community since 1992. But it's not just about money. Although for many individuals and organizations, that's a goal in and of itself. But we're also about how are those dollars spent? And that's where our Project LEAD, which is our education program, educating the lay public in science, that Laura Miller, your fellow Googler, took this past summer, understanding language, concepts, and process of science so that you can sit at the table, help decide what a research agenda should look like, and actually collaborate with individual scientists, and Alana will speak to that also, in designing research. Access to care, a political issue. The Obamacare, the Access to Care Act, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administrations, those are all political entities that we can influence. And the quality of the care that you get access to. There are many federal agencies that actually have a great deal of influence over what that quality is. And we can influence those agencies. And we educate and train people and set an agenda so that the influence is the correct influence. But I want to talk a little bit about 21st century advocacy. NBCC has had an incredible impact in breast cancer in terms of funding for research, access to care, changing how research is done, working with scientists. And we've done a lot of our work through, in the early days, petitions and organizing, collecting 2.6 million signatures, standing on a street corner, stopping people, going door to door, delivering those signatures to the president, resulting in a national action plan on breast cancer. But that doesn't work anymore, because now petitions and signatures are collected through technology, through social media, and now it is not that difficult to get millions of signatures on a petition. And when it's not that difficult to do, it doesn't have as much meaning. So how can the technology help us in today's world in organizing a meaningful and influential grassroots network and having our voices heard in a way that sets us apart from the crowd? Well, we can certainly use your help in having that conversation and figuring that out. But I've laid out a number of statistics and a number of issues in breast cancer to tell you how we really haven't made progress. And as an organization, we were very frustrated by that. And in 2010, we decided to do something about it. We were going to launch a deadline campaign that we will know how to end breast cancer by 2020. And we developed a strategic approach to that question, a strategic plan of action that is set out in a blueprint that you can see on our website. And I won't go into a lot of detail about that, except to talk about the research arm of that, which is the Artemis Project. And our focus here is, we looked around the world of breast cancer and said, where are we in breast cancer? What are the questions that need to be answered that aren't being addressed? And there were two. One is primary prevention. How do we stop women and men from getting breast cancer to begin with? And the second is this idea of metastasis and the spread of breast cancer outside the breast. We know if it's in your breast and doesn't go anywhere, you'll live, and we know if it goes to an organ, you won't. So what's happening in between? No one was really looking at that. They were looking at what to do once it's in that organ, but how does it get there? How can we stop it? And so those are the two areas that we decided to focus on with the Artemis Project as part of our deadline campaign. The Artemis Project is a model for leadership. It is advocate-led, incredible collaboration with scientists from across the country and other countries, different focus. The one thing we ask of the scientists we invite and the advocates is that you're innovative, you know how to be disruptive, you're a critical thinker, you are brave, you're willing to go against the status quo, and you want to come to the table and work with patients to make a difference. And so we have an infrastructure that we've created to launch and maintain the Artemis Project, and it has been incredibly successful. But it would not be successful without someone like Alana Welm, who is a scientist who meets all of those criteria and who comes to the table willingly to work with advocates to really achieve the goal of ending breast cancer. And so I'll turn this over now to Alana. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I would like to echo Fran in thanking you for having us here today. My job today is to tell you where we are in metastatic cancer research and in breast cancer research. I want to cover, again, a little bit more on the real issues in breast cancer, update you on research and therapeutic advances, and then really try to convey this urgent need we have for new and innovative approaches that I think can be best served through community engagement in research. So I'll start by another statistic, and Fran touched on this already to some degree. So breast cancer awareness has been a huge campaign over the last few decades, and it's been successful. Breast cancer awareness is not really the issue anymore. We're doing more mammograms than ever. There's more early diagnoses than ever. And yet, as Fran told you, we're not making the kind of progress we need to end this disease. And so the statistic you can see on the screen here is mortality. This is the number of people who die per population since the mid-1970s until now. And you can see we've made some progress. So there are better treatments. There's new knowledge that has led to better outcomes, like reduction of hormone replacement therapy use has led to a decrease in breast cancer mortality. But you can see on this slide two things. One is we still have racial disparities in breast cancer. And you can see that the rate of progress, as Fran mentioned, is pretty steady. So we're not making these big monumental advances that we need to make to end this disease. At the end, we still have more than 40,000 deaths per year just in this country. That means just in the US, there will be 5 deaths to breast cancer just in the time that we're in this room together. So we really have an urgent need to make substantial progress. Now, why is it that we haven't made progress? So part of my job here today is to try to convey to you the complexity of breast cancer and why it's so difficult. So the reality is that 90% or more of deaths from breast cancer, again, 500,000 in the world every year, are caused by metastasis. That's when the disease spreads outside of the breast to other organs. Breast cancer likes to live in all different parts of the body. It starts in the bones, that's the most common site, but then spreads to other organs and unfortunately is incurable. The trick, though, is that it's not so easy as catching the tumor early and thereby preventing metastasis, getting it before it metastasizes. Those 20 to 30% of breast cancers that eventually come back as metastatic disease do so probably before they're ever diagnosed, probably when the tumor is developing. So there's a biology there where early detection doesn't seem to be helping whether or not these tumors can spread and recur later. Breast cancer is not a single disease. That's another complexity. We think of it as one disease, right? But probably there's at least 15 different types of breast cancer. Every tumor is different. Breast cancer is not one of those cancer that's driven by a particular genetic signature. The heterogeneity is incredible. So that makes it very difficult. So as I mentioned, some of these tumors, that 20 to 30%, have the ability to metastasize while they're forming, before they're even diagnosed. And then what happens is they hide out in the body, typically the bones, but that's also an easy place for us to look, so our data is a bit skewed. They hide out undetected. There's no evidence of disease, and then for some reason, they can grow later. And this can happen 1 year later, 3 years later, or even decades later. So it's this period of clinical dormancy that really is a mystery, because we can't see these cells. We know nothing about what makes them grow or what makes them not grow. You know, again, this is only 20 to 30% of cases in which these cancers come back. When they grow, for some reason, the disease is incurable. And we don't know why. We don't know why that is. And so we really need research that's focused on how to treat these metastases when they arise, and also how to personalize therapy, because as I said, every breast cancer is different. So I think that the ability to treat metastasis, it has been a growing effort in the breast cancer community. Most clinical trials that are started are done in patients with metastatic disease, but we still need to make a lot more progress. I wanted to talk just for a second about sort of a state-of-the-art in personalized therapy, where we can actually now take patients' tumors as they're harvested at surgery and grow those in different model systems in the lab in order to actually test the genetics of the tumor as well as what drugs it might respond to. So this would give a more personalized view of the susceptibilities of those cancers to hopefully direct therapy. The challenge is that this takes time, and once a tumor is metastatic, sometimes the disease progresses too quickly to have that outcome. The reason I'm telling you about this is because I wanted to give you a little bit of a personal story, because this just gives you a view of how metastatic breast cancer most typically arises, and it's too typical. So I'm going to tell you about Mandy. Mandy was a young woman diagnosed with breast cancer at age 29. She had a very small tumor. It expressed the estrogen receptor, so it was the good kind to have because it means it could be treated with hormone therapy. She had surgery. She had radiation, chemotherapy, all the usual breast cancer treatment, even though no one knew if her disease would come back. So those are all just-in-case measures because, again, we don't know who are the 20 to 30% whose tumors might come back later. She endured that therapy, and she was a survivor. Unfortunately, 3 years later, her disease did recur, initially in the bones and then the lungs. But now it had changed, so it had lost the estrogen receptor. But luckily, it had turned on another gene called HER2, which made it susceptible to another very famous treatment called Herceptin. And that worked for a little while, but then disease started popping up in other places, like the brain, the ovaries, and other places. Eventually, it lost the HER2, so the Herceptin was no longer effective. The whole point of this is that the cancers are heterogeneous, they're changing, and we can't see them, so we don't know how to treat these metastatic cases. Unfortunately, her disease progressed before we could get her on any other experimental therapies, and she couldn't tolerate more toxicities. These therapies can be very, very toxic, and unfortunately, she passed away earlier this year at the age of 36. So Mandy used to say to me, I feel like I'm playing whack-a-mole. You know, she used to say that, you know, the therapies that are given are just, you know, they do work. They're FDA approved, but they're trial and error. So, you know, another tumor pops up, and then we treat it, and then another tumor pops up, and we treat it. But it's just like whack-a-mole. And, you know, so this made me start thinking about this. And you all know the whack-a-mole game. But really, this is so much more complex, where you have essentially, this is a picture of a 3D whack-a-mole game, where these moles are popping up, and you're trying to whack them, but you have to be careful that you're not killing the host tissue as well with these toxicities. So that's something that I think it's always a balance between finding the best therapy and trying to not have as much toxicity. So why haven't we made enough progress against deaths from breast cancer? To date, I'd say the main focus on research has really been on that primary tumor that's in the breast. The reason, it's easy to get. We can't do much research in humans, obviously. And these metastases that arise in patients are typically very, very difficult to obtain. So in lieu of that, we have to try to develop sophisticated model systems like the one I told you about before, where we grow patients' tumors in the lab to try to figure out what drugs might work. And it's not that there has been no progress. New therapies have been approved. We have new CDK4/6 inhibitors, and there's excitement about immunotherapy. It's just that each of those therapies typically helps for a little while, but then ultimately there's resistance, and it doesn't extend life as long as we would like. So really, to prevent death from breast cancer, we have to figure out how to treat metastasis and how to prevent it from ever happening in the first place, or, as Fran mentioned, of course, prevent breast cancer from rising at all, even in the breast. So there is a fair amount of excitement about immunotherapy, and I get asked about this a lot, so I thought I'd just give you the overview. The concept here is that you could use your immune system and activate it so that it would hunt out those cancer cells that are hiding in the body. And that's really attractive, because then we don't have to know anything about what's driving those tumors. What is the genetic propensity, or which ones are going to grow where? What targeted therapy should we use? Just think of any virus that you've had. You can't see that. You don't know what it is. You know you're sick, but then you can actually, your immune system will target that virus and kill it, and you get better. So immunotherapy has had amazing advances in diseases like melanoma, metastatic melanoma, and certain types of lung cancers. It's not working very well yet in breast cancer. The response rates are still pretty small, around 10 to 20%, with eventual progression in most of those cases. But because of the excitement, there are thousands and thousands of clinical trials now that are testing immunotherapies and often combining those with other therapies that already exist. So we really need more research. It's really important that we understand the biology of how to make these combinations so that we're not just combining therapies essentially blindly and causing unnecessary toxicities in order for the hope to have better outcomes. The attractive thing, if this works, though, is that immunotherapy, such as a vaccine, for example, could be applied to either treat metastatic disease, prevent those metastatic cells from growing out, or primary prevention. So that brings me back to the Artemis Project that Fran mentioned. She emphasized that this really was an advocate-driven initiative. So this is breast cancer patients and survivors have gotten together and said, here's the urgent issues, and asked the scientists and clinicians to help work toward this problem. I have found it just incredibly transformative, actually, in my science to be involved in this project. So I'm very happy to be involved. As Fran mentioned, there's two key areas. I thought I'd just give you a little tidbit as to where we're going in the scientific direction of those areas. The first area is to prevent breast cancer in the first place, so primary prevention. And the group has really come up with a vaccine strategy to try to do that, where we would be immunizing against 6 particular proteins that get turned on only when breast cells are turning into cancer. The idea is that your immune system would be primed to recognize expression of those proteins and kill those cancer cells before they can form an actual tumor. Initially, this is intended for high-risk individuals. There are people who know they have a very high risk of developing breast cancer because of a family history, for example. The other area, as Fran mentioned, is preventing metastasis. If we could prevent cancers from coming back outside of the breast, we would essentially prevent death from breast cancer. So the goal here is to try to figure out, how do we know who has dormant cells? As I said, only 20 to 30% of cases have these cells that have spread and will eventually recur, but we do not know how to identify who those people are. We don't know how to treat something that we can't see. We can't detect it. We can't measure it. We don't know anything about it, so how can we possibly treat it? The idea would be to eliminate these dormant cells before they become incurable, after they've grown, or to find ways to keep the cells dormant. If somebody lives with dormant cancer cells in their bone marrow their whole life, so be it. That could be a perfectly good outcome. Of course, these two efforts in the Artemis Project are orchestrated alongside all the usual scientific and clinical research that's going on in breast cancer. As Fran mentioned, we have to take all avenues. We have to continue to figure out how to treat breast cancer, how to treat metastatic disease, but we think taking these two approaches could have major long-term impact in the disease. So the big question then is, how do we know who has the dormant cells, and how do we treat something we can't see or measure? And the challenge really is that we don't have these kinds of samples to be able to look at. So this is where I think advocate engagement and community engagement can be really transformative. This is something we've been thinking a lot about in the Artemis Project, where we really have to reprioritize the agenda and focus on the urgency of the problem. If we really need to understand this particular question, we have to figure out a way to do it. And so we have to think outside the box. And I think we need to engage our whole community, because we've all been touched by breast cancer in some way or another. We all are responsible for ending this disease. So in the Artemis Project, one example is we identified the questions related to how to prevent metastasis. Who has the dormant cells that are going to grow, and what do they look like so that we can try to treat those or keep them dormant? We work together through a series of workshops and think tanks where we have breast cancer advocates and patients working directly alongside the researchers and scientists, and really designed approaches that we think could answer these questions and could give us the key to what is the transformative therapy or therapies that could prevent metastasis. And now really our job is to try to execute. Of course, that's easier said than done. We have, just as an example, we have an idea for a really global patient advocate-driven network or partnership where we could potentially try to engage people to acquire those specimens that are needed to look at those dormant cells and to try to determine what might be their Achilles heel that we could target in order to prevent them from ever growing or to kill them. I think we need a unified effort. Everyone, as I said, is affected by breast cancer, but we all need to be invested. So there are a lot of different groups. Some focus on awareness, some focus on early detection, some focus on access to care or disparities in breast cancer. Some want to focus just on how do we treat metastasis. Some want to focus on how do we prevent breast cancer. We all need to work together so that we can have a unified effort to this problem. We need to use every avenue, as Fran said. And I also want to emphasize it's not as though we aren't making any progress. We are learning a lot about the biology of breast cancer, but it's incremental. It's too slow. We understand more about the genetics. We understand more about the tumor microenvironment, but we really need to just all come together and try to figure out a new approach to make this more transformative. And I think these innovative partnerships between advocates, researchers, clinicians, and the community is really the key, the way to go. We need to think big, and we need to be bold. The Deadline campaign is very bold. It was heavily criticized for being so bold, but this is what we have to do. If we don't challenge ourselves to do this, we won't make the progress we need, and people will keep dying of this disease. I would say that we really need to stop thinking that we're limited by what we can do. Well, I can't study those dormant cells because I can't get the samples, or I don't know what they look like. We have to start just figuring out how to do what we can't do yet and make it possible. So I think that being able to engage in the community and put our heads together, very innovative people such as Googlers might be able to help us with that problem. So what can you do? Working with the National Breast Cancer Coalition has been, as I said, transformative for me. I'm very passionate about this work. I think that the mission to end breast cancer is spot on, and this is the way to get it done. I think we need to use innovation and think about how could technology help us in this issue? How can we organize this grassroots movement, get people involved in science, and really tackle this problem? You can get educated about breast cancer. Fran talked about the Project LEAD program that the NBCC holds. It's an excellent program. And just think about how to join the collaboration with researchers and advocates, such as in the Artemis Project, whether you're a scientist or you just want to advocate for the end of this disease. We have the website there for Breast Cancer Deadline 2020, and I think we're prepared to take questions if there are any.
My question is on the prevention side. I read a lot about environmental causes, and it's really hard for me to parse out what's real or what's fake news, fake science. So I'd love to hear a little bit from you both in terms of the environmental potential impacts, or if you think that's not potentially part of this disease.
So the one thing we know environmentally that causes breast cancer is radiation. But radiation at a certain level. So for example, individuals who had a type of lymphoma when they were young and had whole body radiation and heavy doses of radiation, they are very likely to be diagnosed with breast cancer later in life. In terms of the external environment, chemicals, and that, we really don't have high-level evidence that there is a direct relationship between exposure to an environmental toxin and getting breast cancer. All of the information that we have is pretty low-level evidence. There are weak correlations, except maybe DDT was something that had some strong evidence. So what NBCC has tried to do in the past, unfortunately unsuccessfully, was develop public policy that we would have a grant program that would create a collaboration between institutions and community groups across the country that together they could develop a strategic approach to addressing these questions. Because too often we've seen people think, well, it's pesticides, and then you run down that road before you have the evidence that that's actually the right road to take. And so we want to be more analytical and critical about it and make sure that we're using our resources in the right way. So what do we know? And it's not much, but again, there is no high-level, strong evidence of a direct connection between environmental toxins and breast cancer.
Thank you both. This was really interesting and motivating. You talked about how the internet has changed the impact of petitions and gathering signatures and really the ability for that to be leveraged in conversation. Can you also talk a little bit about how the internet has changed your ability to get sustained funding? I think about GoFundMe and really raising money for individuals in their moment of need versus organizations or research. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, we haven't figured out a way to use the internet and social media to fund our organization, and I think others would agree with this, the people that I speak to in other groups, significantly. I think, yes, if there's a disaster, like an earthquake in Haiti or, a flood in Louisiana, people respond to the disaster and give money. If there is an individual, as you mentioned, but people respond, GoFundMe, as an individual with an emotional appeal. But using the internet and social media to raise money for a complicated organization with a pretty complex agenda, but a pretty clear mission, we haven't figured out how to do that yet. And I don't know anyone who has, outside of the Ice Bucket Challenge. Outside of that, I haven't seen or heard of anyone being successful. And if you have ideas about that, boy, would I love to hear them.
I could also try to add about research funding as well. So the kind of scale of research funding that we really need to do the kinds of things I'm talking about, which is really change the agenda and try to do things we've never done before. That kind of funding really needs to come from larger sources like the federal government. There are organizations who do crowdsourcing campaigns, and everything helps to some degree, but I think we're talking about trying to really make this a movement where we can, kind of all come up with a strategy that would be really big. It's bigger than any one research project or another research project. It's a movement that I think again, ideas of how we can use technology to stimulate this are welcome, for sure.
Well, I think you also see GoFundMe for an individual scientist who starts a GoFundMe page to fund research, their individual research. And if you don't know, it all sounds good. So if you want to be careful about what you invest in, and if you want to invest in something that's actually going to make a difference, it's not an easy thing to do because you really have to understand the complexity of the issues in order to make that kind of decision. And that's one of the things we educate and train people to do.
I have a couple of questions, so I'll try to separate them out. The first question is, here at Google, we hear a lot about machine learning and the ability to manipulate genes, to use data to identify trends and then scale those learnings more quickly than we've done in the past. I wondered if you could comment on how, if at all, that's affecting your research today. And then on the flip side of that, I also wanted to understand when you were talking about your strategies, how you think about things like BRCA and how you approach individuals who already have a predisposition, or if you sort of see that as a separate strategy that is maybe overutilized.
Well, I can take the first one, I think, first. So with regard to machine learning and how that's affecting research, I think that really it comes down to big data. So I think we all kind of thought that the genetics of breast cancer and many other cancers would solve the problem. We just had to sequence a lot of tumors, and then we would understand, what is the Achilles heel, and we would develop therapies for those things. And what we learned in breast cancer, unfortunately, was very little. What we learned is every tumor is different. There's not another BRCA1 or BRCA2 gene. And so, but we still need to try to integrate, what that leads to is really bigger data. And maybe we have even more of a need for machine learning, because what we know is we have to integrate that genetic data with also tumor microenvironment data, and maybe even lifestyle data, in order to really make algorithms that could predict not only whether the disease will spread and who needs to be treated, but with what. So it's an incredibly complex challenge. We do have one research project in my lab where, as I mentioned, we try to take personalized approaches in growing patients' tumors and testing drugs. If we can do that on a large enough scale, I think we're past the point of thinking that we could do that for any one individual, because it just takes too long. It's infeasible. But if we can do this for enough tumors, then we can use machine learning to try to figure out what are the features of the tumors that respond to drug A and not drug B, and then take that and apply it now to the population. So that's kind of where we're going with that. But breast cancer is so heterogeneous that it's been much, much more difficult than we ever thought.
I think one of the issues as advocates we have with the focus on data and accumulating data is that people use those data prematurely. So you see a trend or a pattern in a population, and you decide that's a place to intervene before we really understand if that trend is meaningful in terms of mortality or lethality, or if it's just going to add to the overdiagnosis and overtreatment that we have now, which is not a good thing. And we do a lot more of that than we do good for the population. And so we're very concerned about data and how it's used well. Just very quickly, one of the projects that we have is called DNA Land. And I know you all know about 23andMe and Ancestry.com, et cetera. So we're asking individuals who have had sequencing done through one of those programs to send their data to DNA Land and answer a short clinical questionnaire about breast cancer. And we're going to try to see how the data links to, to a higher risk of breast cancer, but more importantly, how it risks to progression of breast cancer. And the advocates are going to control the database, and we're going to make it available to any scientists who want it if they meet certain criteria. So to that extent, we think data is important as a research tool, but as an intervention, we're pretty concerned about the abuse of that information. In terms of BRCA1 and 2, as an organization, we don't focus on any one type of breast cancer. We focus on all breast cancer and ending all breast cancer. What we have done in the area of BRCA1 and 2 is we work very hard to...
Does everyone know what BRCA1 and 2 is?
So if you don't, that is a gene that was cloned back in the 90s that puts you at higher risk of getting breast cancer, significantly high risk of getting breast cancer, and it's linked to family history. And so that particular gene, we work in terms of making certain that public policy, that everything that's done in that area, that there is a connection to genetic counseling, that people understand the importance of that there's funding for genetic counseling, there are enough genetic counselors. We work on clinical trials like the PARP inhibitor trials. We work on those trials. Clinical trials is another project that we do that I didn't have time to go into. But we work on telling the world that if you have a genetic test and you see that you're BRCA positive, you know, your choice right now is to cut off healthy breasts. And that is not a choice anyone should have to make in order. So this is not a good, it's not like we have an answer if you have a genetic test. So we think to a large extent that it is a research tool and we should understand it as such. So it's about education, training, making certain public policies and working on treatment interventions for that population.
Hi, thank you for coming in, and thank you, Laura, for setting this up. My question is around kind of maybe on the heels of Jen. I was pretty surprised to see the very slow movement of progress to find a cure. How often do all of the different breast cancer foundations and associations get together to, obviously everybody's end goal is to save lives, but is there a lot of stepping on toes? I don't understand how the organization world works when there's so many that are striving, it seems, to the same goal. So can you explain a little bit on that?
So it's interesting. When I was diagnosed with breast cancer, I was 39 years old. I was a partner in a law firm in Philadelphia. My son was 14 months old. You know, I sat on nonprofit boards, mostly to do with women's issues. And here then I come into this whole new world of nonprofit at a different level and breast cancer advocacy. And I was stunned by the politics of that world and the competition and the, you know, what is your real mission? What is your real goal? I was stunned by that. So the reason why I got involved in the beginning of NBCC was because it is a coalition of organizations. Our board of directors of our policy arm they're representatives from 25 organizations that are diverse in every way possible. I mean, even politically diverse. I mean, they're really diverse. And so because we believe that if we're going to change systems, we have to have the very diverse perspective that is breast cancer. It shouldn't be what 5 middle-class white women think should happen. In breast cancer, it shouldn't be. So we do work with a coalition of very different organizations to do the system change type of work that we do. In terms of funding, we don't directly fund research, but the organizations that do come together at least once a year with the government funders to look at portfolios and see what's happening. But in terms of other issues, it's impossible to really work together because we really don't all have the same goal. And some organizations, their goal is very narrow and very specific, and it can be at odds with a broader approach to breast cancer. So if your goal is to make certain that everyone has a mammogram, that is not our goal, because we understand the significant limitations of that, and that is not going to end breast cancer. So we will not work together, not that we choose not to, we just don't have an opportunity to work together. But our coalition is a very diverse coalition of different organizations.
I would like to see on a much broader level more acknowledgement that, you know, it's true we don't all have the same goal, immediate goal, right? But I think we all want to end breast cancer. That's the overarching goal. And I think that we could use a more unified effort in that area. And I think if we could unify around, just the acknowledgement that we have to do better, then I think that would be a step forward in progress. Yeah.
How well researched has breast cancer been studied in populations such as transgender women, intersex folks, or in men who have gynecomastia? Gynecomastia.
Yeah. Not well enough. I think these are rare cases of breast cancer. Even male breast cancer, which, as Fran pointed out, is more common than most people are aware, is understudied. There are certain subtypes of women's breast cancers that are understudied, and that really is because breast cancer is not one disease. It's many, many different diseases, and so we don't have good research representation in these sort of small subsets, in part because there's probably not as much funding for that type of research, and also there's not the samples available. It would be very hard to study even male breast cancer, for example, if your institution has one case per year, for example. So it is a challenge for sure.
What's different in October 2017 than, say, October 2015 in terms of your challenges in getting funding and unifying a coalition, getting the support you need from the federal government?
Okay, so two things. Let me answer a different question first about what's different, because I was diagnosed in 1987. If I were diagnosed today, I would get the same treatment. So not much has changed in terms of interventions and therapies. In terms of what's different a year ago, it's harder and harder and more difficult to raise money. Is that your question, raising funding? Yeah, so it's much more difficult to raise money, I think, in large part because of the proliferation of breast cancer groups. So when we started the coalition 25 years ago, there weren't very many groups. There was one group in Pennsylvania. Now I say I wake up every day and there's at least 1,000 more. And some people think that's wonderful. Some people think it's not, because it dilutes the message and it also dilutes your ability to really raise funds because it's being spread around so many different places. And so for us, it's become more and more difficult to raise funding. We do not take government money. So none of our funding comes from the federal government. We lobby for government appropriations that go to the worldwide scientific community, and we have a seat at the table in those federal programs to help influence how the funds are spent, but none of that money comes to us. And I always say if it did, we would have ended breast cancer already, but it doesn't. We have a limitation on the amount of funds we'll take from drug companies. It's only 15% of our budget, and we're very careful how that money is used. So it's very difficult because we have never spent time marketing ourselves. We don't spend time, we don't spend financial resources. We've always just focused on our mission. Does that answer your question?
On the research side, funding is just getting tighter and tighter and tighter. Right now at the National Cancer Institute, it's around 10% of grants that are submitted get funded. And it's not as though 90% are not worth doing. We have a very important breast cancer research program at the Department of Defense. It's also extremely competitive to get funding, and unfortunately that program is really in jeopardy, I think, right now. So yeah, it's getting harder and harder.
Well, I think, though, you have to ask the question, what should get funded? It's not only 10% get funded. Which of those 100% of proposals, which should get funded? Because it really may be that we have maybe too many scientists and too many people asking duplicative, old, not important questions. So what's the strategic approach to figuring out the right amount of funding, looking at it really critically and saying, what do we need to do to end breast cancer? Who is doing it? Who can do it? How much money does that take? Mm-hmm. And we don't ask the question that way.
And how do we
do,
incent
but
those organizations to take the risk on the out-of-the-box thinking when
yes, it's hard
maybe
to.
perceived as more conservative approach to invest in tried and true, same questions over and over?
That's what happens.
But that's where I think the community and advocate partnership with research can make a huge difference, right? Because then, we can set the agenda and the priorities of what is the most impactful way to address this disease and end it. And maybe that's different than the way we've normally been funding research. So I think that that's the kind of thing we're looking for is this kind of big thinking that could make a big difference. Not saying we have to stop the science the way it's going, but we have to do more.
I know we're at time, but maybe, I don't know if this is a quick question. Just kind of heartbroken to hear you say that the treatment hasn't really materialized since you were diagnosed in '89, and for any of us women who've had to have a mammogram or, God forbid, a needle biopsy, you sometimes think, like, if a guy had to go through this, I think this would have changed. I think this all the time, and I'm just wondering if the reason we haven't experienced the change has anything to do that this is a women's predominantly issue, or if it's really a lack of the answers.
I think that it's a complicated disease because it's in women, and we have pretty complicated bodies and biology. I think that, yes, for a long time, women were not included in clinical trials at the NCI because they were more difficult to study. There wasn't a lot of funding in breast cancer, but there wasn't a lot of funding in prostate cancer either. And we really haven't come much further in prostate cancer as we have. It's same almost as breast cancer. So it is yes, because it's in women for a number of reasons, but not completely because of that. But I do want to say one thing, that there have been some new therapies, for example, Herceptin. That's a therapy that is a targeted therapy that we were involved in the clinical trials for that treats women who have HER2 overexpressed breast cancer. And that's about 20% of breast cancer. Before Herceptin, that was the most aggressive breast cancer. Now, after Herceptin, it is one of the least aggressive breast cancers. So it has proven to be effective in the adjuvant setting. That's not in the metastatic setting. So.
Great. Well, thank you so much all for coming. I really appreciate it. And thank you for sharing your minds with my Google family.
And thank you, Laura, for
Yes, thank
inviting
you.
us. Thank you very much.